Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, these are some of the names of the cosmic Old Ones. These unspeakable and primordial gods have haunted our popular subconscious for over a century, and yet, curiously, they originated in the mind of an unlikely creator. Living most of his life as a gangly, socially awkward, and anxiety-ridden outsider, his imagination, however, knew no such bounds. He would populate his lonely world not with benevolent sprites or friendly elves, but with monsters who could drive men to the depths of madness. These are the life and times of Howard Phillips Lovecraft.
In the sprawling suburbs of Providence, Rhode Island, young Lovecraft would be born the son of a traveling salesman, whilst his mother was an heiress of one of the oldest and most aristocratic families on the East Coast. When Lovecraft was only 3 years of age, he would already suffer a debilitating family tragedy. His father was driven by the paralysis of insanity due to an undiagnosed ailment of syphilis. For the next 5 years, Winfield would be confined to a lunatic asylum where he later died. Young Lovecraft was not allowed to visit Winfield, and sadly, the boy would never see his father again. For the next several years, Howard and his mother Susan would be confined to their moderate-sized house on Angel Street. As a result of the loss of his father and his mother's almost pathological emotional neglect, young Lovecraft grew up as a social recluse in many ways. He would often avoid any kind of social interaction and was relegated to stewing in his own loneliness. Many historians seem to agree that Susan Lovecraft did love her son, but was, for whatever reason, emotionally incapable of expressing that affection after the death of Winfield. which by Howard's own admission was psychologically damaging to him. Lovecraft's only relief was in the form of his grandfather, one Whipple Phillips, who for many years was the only form of masculine role model and father figure that young Lovecraft had. Whipple was a successful industrialist and entrepreneur, and through his success, provided young Lovecraft with mentorship and drive. One memory that Lovecraft showed a particular fondness for was of his grandfather's old library. Howard recalled that he used to sneak away into the attic library in the dead of night with only a small candle for a light source and sit and read some of the old classics such as Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, and even Chaucer. But his favorite was always Edgar Allan Poe. Through the influence of his grandfather and many of the old books he mentally devoured, Lovecraft developed a life philosophy of old-world gentlemanly stature and in many ways fell in love with the 18th century. When Lovecraft was only 14, his beloved grandfather Whipple died. In the aftermath, Lovecraft and his mother lost his house, his library sanctuary, and really any sense of security he may have had up until that time. Despondent, listless, and dejected, Lovecraft decided to turn to the only thing that brought any kind of enjoyment: his writing. At first, he attempted to write many stories in the style of his literary hero Poe, but most of these early stories were discarded and destroyed by Lovecraft, his sense of obsessive, compulsive perfection distracting him at every turn. Late in his teen years and early 20s, Lovecraft would suffer from acute depression. His loneliness, lack of successful career prospects, and terrible social awkwardness seemed to drive him deeper and deeper into his melancholic state. During the summer of 1917, Lovecraft would discover the small world of amateur journalism in which he would find a thriving group of fledgling authors that were very much like young Howard in their drive for storytelling. Later on, he would credit the discovery of the amateur and pulp scene to finally snapping him out of his depression. It was also during this time that Lovecraft developed a sense of what he called conservative nationalism. He thought the United States was being far too influenced by early forms of globalism, something he readily railed against. Lovecraft was forming friendships at a rapid pace, and as a result, his confidence and sense of self-worth began to grow. The man the world would later know as the personality of H.P. Lovecraft was blossoming out of his shell. All of his growing confidence would ultimately pay off in the form of Lovecraft's very first published story entitled Dagon, a short piece that tells the tale of a stranded German raider who encounters a race of terrifying fish people he called his Deep Ones. It would be this story that forever set the eponymous Lovecraftian model. Yet due to his anti-commercial sentiments, Lovecraft would accept paltry payments for his stories and, in order to make a living, hired out his services as a ghostwriter, a vocation in which he would be published many times, albeit under pseudonyms. While Lovecraft was beginning to ride high in his writing career, his mother, Susan, was not faring nearly as well. Susan had been sequestered in the same sanitarium that had claimed the life of her husband, Winfield, and in the spring of 1921 suddenly died of a gallbladder infection. After the death of his mother, Lovecraft would be hit with a financial crisis, one only alleviated after he was sent to live with his two aunts. Even though he had found a temporary solution to his money woes, Lovecraft knew he had to find a more stable writing gig, and he found it in the form of a weekly publication known as The Home Brew. It was during this time that Lovecraft created one of his most influential pieces outside of his famous Cthulhu mythos, namely Herbert West, Reanimator. His time at Home Brew seemed to once again jumpstart his drive for life, and his confidence only grew from there. During a convention of authors and publishers in Boston, Massachusetts, Lovecraft would meet his future wife, a woman named Sonia Haft-Green. Sonia was almost the direct opposite of Lovecraft. She was 7 years his senior, outgoing, talkative, and even had a mind for business. The two bonded over their mutual love of writing. Lovecraft's aloofness and sense of old-world honor seemed to strongly attract her to the 34-year-old author, and in the winter of 1924, the two were married. The newlyweds moved to New York, where Sonia operated a successful boutique and hat store. It was during this time that Lovecraft would be introduced to the publication that would have the most significant impact on Lovecraft's contribution to the literary world. In March of 1923, Weird Tales rolled off the printing presses, and Lovecraft would join a litany of some of the most famous fantasy and science fiction writers that we're familiar with today. The likes of Robert E. Howard, Robert Bloch, and Ray Bradbury all got their prospective starts in the pages of Weird Tales. However, the specter of financial difficulty would once again dog Lovecraft when his wife lost her thriving business. Having to move away to Ohio for another job offer, Sonia regrettably left her husband back in New York as Lovecraft refused to follow. His reasoning for this was left ambiguous, but many speculate that it was his hatred of travel in general that kept him from the move. In the spring of 1926, Lovecraft decided to leave New York behind as well and move back to Rhode Island. The coupling of the strain of the move and his separation from his wife resulted in the birth of one of pop culture's most iconic demons. In the pages of Weird Tales, the dread high priest Cthulhu was born. After a prolonged separation, both Lovecraft and his wife agreed that the two of them had simply drifted too far apart, and after much discussion and soul-searching, they agreed to end their marriage. Sonia would later travel to Europe and eventually settled in California. Even though she would remarry, Sonia always cherished her time with Lovecraft and was grateful to be associated with a man she would call brilliant and, in many ways, wise beyond his years. Lovecraft himself seemed to develop a laser kind of focus on his creative output after his divorce and would pen such seminal stories as The Whisperer in Darkness, The Dunwich Horror, and, of course, At the Mountains of Madness. Sadly, the next 8 years would see a return to the all-familiar loneliness that had plagued his younger self. Depression had gripped him once again, and to expound upon his problems, Lovecraft's physical health was taking a turn for the worse. The tragedies in his personal life would only continue. One of Lovecraft's closest friends, the renowned writer Robert E. Howard, had committed suicide, himself being haunted by a terrible melancholy that consumed his thoughts. Unbeknownst to Lovecraft, he had developed a severe and terminal form of cancer that went undiagnosed and untreated. Perhaps it was by design or fate, but on the Ides of March 1937, Lovecraft succumbed to his ailments, and the world lost one of the most prominent minds in the annals of horror.
H.P. Lovecraft reaches the pinnacles of creative inspiration for myself. Now, I was first introduced to his work at the tender age of only 8 years old when I was browsing through my elementary school's library and discovered The Shadow over Innsmouth. My curiosity was piqued, so I decided to read the odd story, and I was immediately hooked. Over the next year or so, I had devoured The Call of Cthulhu, The Rats in the Walls, The Dunwich Horror, and The Color Out of Space, with many more stories to follow. I was enthralled with the intricate and terrible universe that Lovecraft had created, and it was his work that set the gold standard for cosmic horror ever since as it pertained to my tastes. Lovecraft's work had such an impact on me that I promised myself that I would one day find a way to contribute to the Cthulhu mythos as Lovecraft had encouraged so many before me to do. Now the result is my film Keep Smiling, The Grinning Man Murders, in which I try to meld the universe of Lovecraft with the real-life historical paranormal events such as the infamous Mothman. Now, of course, it's a shameless plug, but check it out if you have time. H.P. Lovecraft's impact on current-day popular culture cannot be overstated. He has influenced writers, artists, filmmakers, and visionaries for the better part of a century, and it's not very hard to see why. Rest in peace, Mr. Lovecraft. Your legacy endures on both our imaginations and our nightmares. As we always say around here, question everything and trust no one. Until next time.